Hello everybody, I hope you're well. We're carrying on reading Kenzuke's Kingdom. We're on chapter 7. We're on page 102 if you're following along. I could see the dark gleam of metal pots and pans lined up on a nearby wooden shelf. There were other shelves too, lined with tins and jars, dozens of them, all of different shapes and sizes, and hanging beneath them innumerable bunches of dried herbs and flowers. These he would often be mixing or pounding, but I wasn't sure why. Sometimes he would bring them over to me, just for me to smell them. The cave house was sparsely furnished. To one side of the cave mouth stood a low wooden table, barely a foot off the ground. There he kept his paintbrushes, always neatly laid out, and several more jars, bottles, and saucers too. Kenzuke lived and worked almost entirely near the mouth of the cave, where there were more daylight. At night he would roll out his sleeping mat across the cave from me, up against the far wall. I would wake in the early morning sometimes and just watch him sleeping. He always lay on his back, wrapped in a sheet, and never moved a muscle. Kenzuke would spend many hours of each day kneeling at the table and painting. He painted on large shells, but much to my disappointment, he never showed me what he had done. Indeed, he barely seemed pleased with his work, for just as soon as he had finished, he would usually wash off what he had done and start again. On the far side of the cave mouth was a long workbench, and hanging up above it was an array of tools, saws, hammers, chisels, all sorts. And beyond the workbench were 3 large wooden chests in which he would frequently rummage around for shells, or perhaps his clean sheets. We had clean sheets every single night. Inside the cave he wore a wraparound dressing gown, a kimono, later I knew it to be. He kept the cave immaculately clean, sweeping it down once a day at least. There was a large bowl of water just inside the cave mouth. Every time he came in, he would wash his feet and dry them before stepping inside. The floor was entirely covered with mats made of wooden rushes, like the sleeping mat. The floor was entirely covered with mats made of woven rushes, just like the sleeping mats, and everywhere all around the cave, to head height and above the walls, were lined with bamboo. It was simple, but it was home. There were no clutter, everything had its place and its purpose. As I got better, Kenzuke would go off and leave me on my own. He did this for more and more, but thankfully never for too long. He'd return later, very often singing, with fish, perhaps fruit, coconuts or herbs, which he'd bring over to show me proudly. The orangutans would sometimes come with him, but only as far as the cave mouth. They'd peer in at me, and at Stella, who always kept her distance. Only the young ones ever tried to venture in, and then Kenzuke had to clap hands at them, and they'd soon go scooting off. During these early days in the cave house, I so much wished we could talk. There were 1,000 mysteries, 1,000 things I wanted to know. But it still hurt me to talk, and besides, I felt he was quite happy with our silence, that he preferred it somehow. He seemed a very private person, and content to be that way. Then, one day, after hours of kneeling hunched over at his paintings, he came over and gave it to me. It was a picture of a tree in blossom. His smile said everything. "For you, Japan tree," he said. "I, Japanese person." After that, Kenzuke showed me all of the paintings he did. even the ones he later washed off. They were all in black and whitewash, all of orangutans, gibbons, butterflies, dolphins, birds, and fruit. Only very occasionally did he keep one, storing it away carefully in one of his chests. He did keep several of the tree paintings, I noticed, always of a tree in blossom, a Japan tree, as he called it, and I could see he took particular joy in showing me these. It was clear he was allowing me to share something very dear to him, and I felt very honoured by that. In the dying light of each day, he would sit beside me and watch over me, the last of the evening sun on his face. I felt he was healing me with his eyes. At night, I often thought of my mother and father. I so much wanted to see them again, to let them know I was actually still alive. But strangely, I no longer missed them. In time, I found my voice again. The paralysis gradually lost its grip on me, and my strength flowed back. Now I could go out with Kenzuke whenever he invited me, and to be honest, he often did. To begin with, I would squat on the beach with Stella and watch him spear fish in the shallows. So still he stood, and his strike was lightning fast. Then, one day, he made my own spear. I was to fish with him. He taught me where the bigger fish were, where the octopus hid, how they hid under the rocks, how to stand still as a heron and wait, spear poised just above the water, my shadow falling behind me so that the fish were not frightened away. I tell you, spearing a fish for the first time was like scoring a winning goal for the mudlarks back home. Just about the best feeling in the world. Kenzuke seemed to know every tree in the forest, where all the fruit grew, what was ripe and what was not what was worth climbing for. He climbed impossible trees nimbly, footsure and fearless. Nothing in the forest alarmed him, not the howling gibbons swinging above his head to drive him off their fruit, not the bees that swarmed around him when he carried down their comb from a hollow high in the tree. He used the honey for sugaring and for bottling fruit. And always his family of orangutans came along, shadowing us through the forest, patrolling the tracks ahead, scampering along behind. All Kenzuke had to do was sing, and they'd come. They seemed almost hypnotised by his sound. They were intrigued by me and by Stella, but they were nervous and we were nervous. So we always kept our distance from one another. One evening, quite unexpectedly, as I was watching Kenzuke at his fishing, one of the young ones clambered on my lap and began to examine my nose with his finger, and then he investigated my ears. He pulled it rather harder than I'd liked, but I didn't yelp. After that, the rest followed suit, using me as if I were a climbing frame. Even the older ones, the bigger ones, would reach out and touch me from time to time, but thankfully they were always more reserved, more circumspect. But Stella still kept a certain distance from them, and them from her. In all this time, I suppose, I must have been some months on the island. Kenzuke had said very little. The little English he did speak was clearly hard for him. When words were used between us, they proved to be of little help in our understanding of each other. So we resorted, for the most or part, to smiles and nods, to signing and pointing. Sometimes we even drew pictures in the sand to explain ourselves. It was just enough to get along. but there was so much more that I was burning to find out. How had he come to be here, all alone on the island? How long had he been here? How had he come across all those pots, pans, tools, and the knife he always wore on his belt? How come one of his wooden chests was stuffed with sheets? Where had they all come from? Where had he come from? And why was he being so kind to me now, so considerate, when he had clearly resented me so much before? But whenever I ventured any such question, he would simply shake his head and turn away from me like a deaf man ashamed of his affliction. I was never quite sure whether he really did not understand or did not want to understand. Either way, I could see it just made him uncomfortable, so I probed no more. Questions, it seemed, were an intrusion. I resigned myself to waiting. Our life together was always busy and regular as clockwork. Up at dawn, down the track a little way to bathe in the stream, where it tumbled cold and fresh out of the hillside with a great cauldron of small rocks. We would wash our sheets and clothes there too. He'd made me my own kimono by now, slapping and pounding them on the rocks before hanging them up to dry on the branches of a nearby tree. Breakfast was thick, pulpy fruit juice, which seemed different every day, and banana or coconut. I never tired of banana, but very soon became sick of coconut.